Alright, AP Human Geography classes, here's our last video on urban patterns, and we're going to focus on actually suburbs and why they face distinctive challenges opposite inner cities. Let's get to it. Alright, so what is a suburb? Kind of where you live. Alright, well, what literally is it? It's an outlying district legally independent of a city. And, almost every suburb can be tied to a central city, and we'll talk about that. Sometimes suburbs are also labeled as edge cities. So there's a process called suburbanization, right? And what that is, during the 1950s, these Levittowns were created. What it is, it's an expansion of an area on the fringe of cities. So sprawl started in the cities and then went to these suburban areas. Some statistics here. In 1950, 20% of the United States population lived in the suburbs, and in 2000, 50% lived in suburbs. So in 50 years, we have a 30% increase. So a lot of people are living in suburban areas. All right, let's talk about something called the MSA, or the Metropolitan Statistical Area. What this is it analyzes the functional area of a city. So this must include the following. It must have at least 50,000 plus people. It has to have part of the county within the central city, and the county density has to be 25 persons per square mile, with half of them working in the city. Let's go into more detail. The MSA, or the Metropolitan Statistical Area, encompasses 84% of the population of the United States, and to some degree, sometimes it's an extensive area outside of the central city or the urban spectrum. Morris County is technically within the Newark Union Metropolitan Statistical Area. So there's 50,000 plus people in the county, obviously. Part of the county is near the central city portion of Newark and Union, all right, and so on and so forth. All right, let's talk about something about the USA, not the United States, all right, something different. Micropolitan Statistical Area. They couldn't give an acronym of MSA. It would have been the same as the metropolitan. So what is this? Well, it's a smaller urbanized area that includes between 10 to 50,000 inhabitants and everything else from the metropolitan. About 10% of Americans live in these areas, and these micropolitan areas are mostly found in the south and west of the United States. All right, now together, the MSA and the Micropolitan Statistical Area, well, they form something called the core-based statistical areas. All right, now let's get on to another model. You're so lucky. We talked previously about core and periphery. All right, well, let's get into something called the peripheral model, or also known as the galactic model. It was created by Chauncey Harris, actually one of the creators of the multiple nuclei model, in about the 60s. And so what he stated was this. He noticed that urban areas consist of an inner city surrounded by a large suburban residential area tied to some sort of beltway or roadway to get in the city and out of the city. All right, now there are some positives of this model. Obviously, the periphery areas or suburban areas, well, they lack the physical, social, and economic problems that we talked about last video in inner cities. But big drawbacks of this model is that it created these isolated and segregated nodes of suburban sprawl, all right, these areas. So going back to core and periphery, the core, if you will, is the central city. The periphery is the suburban area, all right, and resources such as workers are going from the periphery to the core area. Let's talk about density gradient and suburban sprawl. All right, so as you travel farther from the city, population density decreases, hence density gradient, as well as the number of houses diminishes. So if you look at this little picture here with lights, you can see the central city portion, and as you work your way out, going east, west, north, and south, you can see that population density decreases as well as the number of houses due to the lighting. All right, let's jump to suburban sprawl. So what is suburban sprawl? Very similar to urban sprawl. It's the progressive spread of development, but in a suburban area, all right? And yes, there are some negative impacts of suburban sprawl. So, for example, road and utility systems, well, they have to be extended all the way out to reach these now isolated areas from the city. What happens is it causes higher home prices, right, that offset this expense. So actually when you pay for a home in the suburbs, right, this is the reason why that it's a little more expensive than, let's say, somewhere closer to the city. Also, there's increased use of energy, specifically through gas, aka through travel, specifically, cars using up more gasoline, so on and so forth. All right, let's talk about how suburbanization has actually changed the landscape. So retailers we talked about were originally located in the CBD and now have moved to more suburban areas, and here's the reasons why. They're attracted to lower costs of land as well as taxes. So in fact, larger retailers are usually found now more so in shopping malls and strip malls than in larger cities. All right. Also, factories and offices moved from urban to suburban areas, for the very same reason. If you want to expand a large factory, it's much cheaper and easier in a suburban area than in an urban area. Also, it's easier to facilitate trucking shipments when they're coming into suburban areas with less traffic congestion. Now, the problem is to fill the employees of, let's say, an office or a factory, all right, suburban areas lack mass transit, so it's very hard for some individuals to get to suburban areas if you don't already live there. Now, let's get to that. issue with getting to suburban areas. All right, transportation. We talked about this briefly before in class, but mass transit doesn't reach all suburban areas. Sure, do trains go to suburban areas? Absolutely, they have certain stops, but to get to other towns, you might need to drive a car. So thus, something called fixed light rail transportation, or a car, is the most popular method of travel throughout the United States. In fact, the U.S. government actually encourages the use of cars over mass transit since its inception, and we'll talk more about that. Now, the reason why there's traffic congestion during rush hours, hence more people use cars than, let's say, mass transit, because again, some people live in isolated regions. Fixed heavy rail transport, such as subways, trains, and buses, are only catered to certain areas. So maybe to go from one part of your town, let's say to the central city, you might have to go to a certain area, maybe the next town over, to make it easier. What's interesting is Europeans have invested more in public transportation than the United States, and it all stems back to since the 1950s and the popularization of the car, that the United States didn't see mass transit as a vital necessity since people could easily afford cars. Now we are dealing with heavy rail transport in a deteriorating infrastructure, as well as an increased amount of cars on the road causing congestion and wasting energy through gasoline. All right, guys, that was it. We'll talk more about this in class. See you then.